The Willamette Valley, in the late autumn of 1887, was a place defined by its dampness, a pervasive, creeping chill that seeped into the marrow of the timber and the bones of the men who worked it. It was a landscape of towering, ancient evergreens that stood like silent sentinels against a perpetually bruising sky, and of rich, dark earth that turned to a thick, unyielding mire with the first serious rains of October. The air always carried the heavy, complex scent of wet pine needles, decomposing leaves, and the faint, metallic tang of cold river water. It was not a gentle country. It demanded a certain kind of stubborn endurance from the people who chose to settle there, a willingness to work alongside the weather rather than fight it, and a quiet acceptance of the isolation that the sprawling geography enforced. In this valley, near the small, struggling settlement of Teller's Creek, a man's worth was measured not by the words he spoke, but by the steadiness of his hands, the condition of his livestock, and the straightness of his boundary fences. Daniel Holt was a man perfectly suited to such a place. At 28 years old, he had the weathered, settled look of a man who had already lived a full life of quiet observation. He was not a tall man, but he was built with a dense, compact solidity, like a block of seasoned oak. His hands were heavily calloused, permanently stained with harness leather dye and the dark soil of his horse ranch, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to take in everything while giving away absolutely nothing. He had arrived in the valley 2 years prior, purchasing a long, sloping tract of land that bordered the winding, unpredictable waters of the creek. He raised Morgan horses, breeding them for the kind of sturdy, reliable endurance that the Oregon terrain required. He was a man of profound, almost frustrating silence. He did not frequent the saloon in Teller's Creek. He did not engage in the idle, speculative gossip that fueled the small community, and he rarely spoke a sentence that required more than 5 words when 3 would suffice. He communicated through the steady rhythm of his work, the meticulous care he gave his animals, and the undeniable quality of his character. He was honorable, reliable, and entirely unaware of the profound loneliness that had settled into his bones. To the immediate west of Daniel's property lay the Nash farm, a modest but fiercely maintained homestead run by Silas Nash and his daughter Clara. Silas was a man slowly being defeated by time and the damp cold of the valley. His knees had betrayed him a decade ago, and his eyesight was failing, leaving the vast majority of the heavy, practical labor to Clara. Clara Nash was 25, an age that, in Teller's Creek, often invited pitying glances and whispered speculations about a woman's prospects. But there was nothing pitiable about Clara. She was the anchor of the Nash property, a woman of deep, practical competence and a quiet, resilient strength. She did not possess the delicate, fragile beauty favored by the romantic novels of the time. Rather, her beauty was grounded in her capability. She had steady, intelligent brown eyes, hair the color of roasted chestnuts that she kept ruthlessly pinned back from her face, and hands that were as familiar with the swing of an axe as they were with the delicate stitching of a torn linen shirt. She had spent the last 7 years nursing her dying mother, and then caring for her ailing father, giving her youth to a family that could never repay her in anything but gratitude. She had learned to endure, to wait, and to find a deep, sustaining contentment in the small, necessary tasks of survival. For 2 years, the primary connection between Daniel Holt and Clara Nash had been the long, undulating boundary fence that separated their properties. It was a physical barrier of split cedar posts and heavy barbed wire, but it had slowly, almost imperceptibly, transformed into a place of shared, unspoken communion. Daniel had spent those 2 years finding quiet, entirely logical reasons to be near that fence. He would ride his gelding along the perimeter at dawn, his eyes scanning the wire for imaginary breaks, his attention entirely focused on the distant figure of Clara feeding her chickens or hanging wet laundry on the line. He would find a post that seemed marginally less plumb than the others and spend an hour digging it out and resetting it, simply to have an excuse to remain in her proximity. He was a slow man, emotionally reserved and profoundly cautious, and he did not fully understand the pull that drew him to the boundary line. He only knew that the days when he saw her felt anchored and real, and the days when the rain kept her indoors felt hollow, echoing with a quiet dissatisfaction. Clara, for her part, had noticed him noticing her since the very first week he had arrived in the valley. She was a woman who saw the world with a clear, unsentimental gaze, and she had read the language of Daniel's actions long before he had deciphered it himself. She had seen the way his horse always seemed to drift toward her property line. She had noticed the meticulous, entirely unnecessary repairs he made to sections of the fence that were already perfectly sound. She had observed the way he would stop his work and stand perfectly still, leaning against a post, whenever she walked out onto her porch. She understood the profound, aching hesitation in him. She knew that he was a man who needed time to align his heart with his mind, a man who could not be rushed, and so, with the infinite patience that had defined her entire life, she waited. She did not force the issue. She simply made sure she was there, a steady, constant presence on the other side of the wire. Their interactions were sparse, defined by a profound economy of words and a heavy reliance on the unspoken gesture. In the first winter, when a brutal ice storm had brought a massive pine branch down across the fence, destroying 20 yards of wire, they had worked together for 3 days to clear the timber and rebuild the line. They had barely spoken a dozen words during the entire endeavor. He had handled the heavy lifting, the sawing and the stretching of the wire, while she had managed the tools, the leather gloves, and the heavy iron staples. At the end of the 3rd day, when the freezing rain had begun to fall again, she had silently handed him a steaming cup of chicory coffee from a thermos she had brought from the house. He had taken it, their thick leather gloves brushing for a fraction of a second. He looked at her. "Much obliged," he said. She kept her eyes on the steam rising from the cup. "It was our tree that fell on your wire." That was the extent of their conversation, but the shared quiet between them in the freezing rain had felt more intimate than 1,000 spoken declarations. As the seasons turned, the gestures became slightly more pronounced, though still cloaked in the guise of neighborly practicality. In the spring, when Clara's father had been bedridden for a week with a severe chest cold, Daniel had silently appeared in their yard before dawn every morning to chop a day's worth of firewood, leaving the neatly stacked pile on the porch before riding away without ever knocking on the door. In return, when Daniel had torn his heavy canvas work coat on a stray piece of wire, Clara had noticed the ragged tear from across the fence. The next day, when Daniel had left the coat draped over a post while he worked in the sun, he returned to find the tear meticulously mended with a heavy waxed thread, the stitches so small and precise they were barely visible. He had stood by the post for a long time, running his thumb over the mended canvas, a strange, tight feeling blooming in his chest. He had looked up toward her house, but she was nowhere to be seen. There was also the matter of the books. Silas Nash was a reader, possessing a small but cherished library of histories, botanical texts, and the occasional novel. When Silas had casually mentioned to Daniel during a rare encounter at the general store that he possessed a comprehensive volume on equine anatomy, Daniel had expressed a mild, polite interest. The next day, Clara had walked to the fence line and handed the heavy, leather-bound book across the wire. "Father thought you might find this useful," she said. Daniel took it carefully. "I will return it promptly." He had kept it for a month. When he finally returned it, it was wrapped tightly in a piece of oiled canvas to protect it from the damp. Inside the front cover, tucked neatly against the binding, Clara had found a single, perfectly preserved hawk feather. She had traced the edge of the feather with her finger, a small, knowing smile touching her lips, and she had placed it inside her own copy of a poetry anthology. Over the next year, they exchanged 6 more books. They never discussed the contents. The books were simply a physical manifestation of their connection, a way to hand a piece of themselves across the boundary line without having to speak the terrifying words that such a gesture implied. The town of Teller's Creek, functioning as a collective, observant entity, was well aware of the slow, agonizingly deliberate dance occurring on the valley edge. The older women who gathered at the mercantile to purchase flour and trade gossip found it a source of endless, affectionate frustration. Elias Thorne, the proprietor of the general store, was a man who prided himself on his blunt assessments of human nature. He had watched Daniel Holt come into his store every 2 weeks to purchase supplies, always buying slightly more coffee than a single man could reasonably consume, and always casting a brief, involuntary glance toward the jars of hard candy that Clara occasionally bought for her father. One Tuesday, as Elias was tallying Daniel's ledger, he paused and looked at the younger man over the rims of his spectacles. "You have a remarkable inability to see what is standing right in front of you, Mr. Holt." Daniel carefully secured the lid on a tin of saddle soap. "I see perfectly well, Elias." The store owner snorted. "You see horses. You see fence lines. You do not see that the town looks out for her, and the town is running out of patience watching you stare at a cedar post like it's going to strike up a conversation." Daniel had paid his bill in silence, his jaw tight, but the words had planted a seed of acute, uncomfortable awareness in his mind. The catalyst arrived in the form of the annual Cooper Barn Dance in late November. The Coopers owned the largest farm in the valley, and their barn, freshly cleared of the autumn harvest, was the only structure large enough to hold the entire scattered population of Teller's Creek. The dance was the social event of the year, a desperate, joyous attempt to stave off the crushing isolation of the impending winter. The weather, which had been miserable for 3 days, suddenly broke on the afternoon of the dance, the heavy clouds parting to reveal a sharp, crystalline sky and a biting cold that froze the mud into hard, navigable ridges. The valley residents descended upon the Cooper farm in wagons, on horseback, and on foot, drawn by the light of 100 lanterns and the frantic, rhythmic scraping of 3 local fiddlers. Daniel had not intended to go. He was not a man for crowds, and the prospect of navigating the complex social currents of the town filled him with a quiet dread. But as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, he had looked out his window and seen the Nash wagon slowly making its way down the rutted road toward the Cooper property. Silas was driving, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe, and Clara sat beside him. She was wearing a dress of deep, dark blue wool, a color that made her skin look like porcelain in the fading light. Daniel had watched the wagon until it disappeared around the bend. He had stood in the center of his dark, quiet house for 10 minutes. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he had washed his face, put on his only clean white shirt and his dark wool coat, saddled his gelding, and ridden into the night. The atmosphere inside the Cooper barn was thick with the heat of 80 bodies, the smell of roasted pork, sawdust, and cheap whiskey, and the deafening noise of laughter and music. When Daniel stepped through the wide double doors, a subtle ripple of awareness passed through the room. He was a respected man, a successful rancher, and entirely unattached. Every mother with an eligible daughter, and every eligible daughter themselves, noticed his arrival. He was immediately offered plates of food and cups of cider, and drawn into conversations about the price of oats and the likelihood of a harsh winter. He answered politely, his demeanor steady and calm, but his pale blue eyes never stopped moving. He was scanning the room, looking past the bright dresses and the eager faces, searching for a specific shade of dark blue wool. He found her standing near the rear of the barn, near the large, open doors that looked out over the darkened valley. She was speaking with Mary Cooper, the hostess, holding a cup of cider in her capable hands. She looked striking. The simple cut of the dress emphasized the strong, elegant lines of her shoulders and the confident posture she always maintained. As Daniel watched her, a man approached her. It was Arthur Pendleton, the new assistant manager of the bank in town. Pendleton was a respectable obstacle, a man of means and education, wearing a suit that cost more than Daniel's saddle. Pendleton smiled at Clara, said something charming, and offered his arm. Clara smiled politely, a small, guarded expression, and shook her head, gesturing slightly to her cup. Pendleton lingered, clearly intent on trying again. Daniel felt a sudden, cold clarity settle over him. It was a physical sensation, a tightening in his chest, and a sudden sharpening of his vision. He realized, with the blunt force of a falling tree, that his 2 years of quiet waiting, his endless fence repairs, his borrowed books, were entirely insufficient. The world was not going to wait for him to find his words. Other men could see what she was. Other men would not hesitate. He had spent his life being steady, being careful, being slow. But standing in the noisy, crowded barn, watching Arthur Pendleton lean closer to Clara Nash, Daniel understood that slowness in this moment was a form of cowardice. He moved across the barn floor. He did not rush, but there was a deliberate, unstoppable momentum to his stride that caused people to naturally step out of his way. He walked straight past Elias Thorne, who raised a single, approving eyebrow. He walked past the fiddlers, past the dancing couples, until he reached the rear doors. Arthur Pendleton was just opening his mouth to speak again when Daniel stopped directly in front of Clara. He ignored Pendleton entirely. He looked down at Clara, his pale eyes entirely focused on hers. The noise of the barn seemed to fade into a distant, irrelevant hum. He stood there for a long moment. Clara looked up at him. She did not seem surprised. There was a quiet, luminous expectation in her brown eyes. She took a slow breath, the blue wool of her dress rising and falling. "Clara," he said. His voice was low, carrying only to her. "Daniel," she replied. It was the first time she had used his Christian name in 2 years. "I would like to dance." It was a request, but it sounded like a statement of absolute fact. Clara looked at his extended hand, the calluses, the permanent stains of his labor. She did not take it immediately. Instead, she handed her half-empty cup of cider to a bewildered Arthur Pendleton. She looked back at Daniel. She saw the tension in his jaw, the profound effort it had taken for him to cross the room, and she made a decision. She was the patient anchor, but she was also a woman of immense practical action. She was not going to let this moment unfold in the middle of a crowded barn, surrounded by the speculative eyes of Teller's Creek. She reached out, but instead of taking his hand for the dance floor, she grasped his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Follow me," she said. Before Daniel could process the command, she was pulling him away from the music, away from Pendleton, and out the wide rear doors into the freezing, star-swept night. The sudden transition from the stifling heat of the barn to the biting cold of the November air was shocking. Daniel stumbled slightly, but she did not release her grip. She led him away from the wagons, away from the horses tethered to the post, and toward a narrow, winding trail that cut up the steep hillside behind the Cooper property. It was dark, the only light provided by the sliver of a crescent moon and the millions of stars scattered across the black canvas of the sky. The ground was hard and uneven, covered in fallen pine needles that made their footing treacherous. Daniel followed her blindly, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He could hear the rustle of her heavy wool dress, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the crunch of their boots on the frozen earth. They climbed for 10 minutes, leaving the noise of the fiddles and the laughter far below them. The air grew thinner, colder, and scented purely of pine and frost. Finally, they reached a small, natural clearing that sat like a shelf on the side of the hill. It was a place Clara had discovered years ago, a private sanctuary where she would sometimes come to escape the crushing responsibilities of her life. She had never brought anyone else here. Below them, the Willamette Valley spread out like a dark, rolling ocean, dotted only by the warm, yellow pinpricks of lantern light from the scattered farms. The Cooper barn was the brightest cluster, a small beacon of human activity in the vast wilderness. Clara stopped near the edge of the clearing and finally released his wrist. She turned to face him, her breath plumed in the freezing air, silver in the starlight. She did not say a word. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. She had brought him to the threshold. He had to walk through the door. Daniel stood before her. His chest was heaving, partly from the climb, but mostly from the terrifying magnitude of what he was about to do. He looked at the lights below, then back to her face. He took off his hat, holding it tightly in his hands. He was a steady homesteader, a man of harness leather and lineament, and he possessed no poetry. He could only offer the unadorned truth. "I am a slow man," he began, his voice rough, scraping against the absolute silence of the clearing. "I know that. I take too long to see things that are plain." Clara watched him, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I have spent 2 years looking for broken wire that wasn't there," Daniel continued, stepping half a pace closer. "I have dug up solid posts just to have a reason to stand near your yard. I read a book on the root systems of the western fern, and I hate ferns, Clara. I read it because you touched the pages." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her mouth, but she remained silent. "I saw Pendleton looking at you," he said, his voice dropping an octave, a note of raw, possessive honesty entering his tone. "And I realized I could not go back to my empty house and pretend that fixing a fence was enough. It is not enough. I am done being your quiet neighbor." He stopped. He had run out of words. He stood there, vulnerable and exposed, waiting for her judgment. Clara looked at him for a long time. She saw the honorable, reliable man who had chopped wood in the dark and mended his own coat just to show her he appreciated her skill. She saw the man who understood the value of silence, but who had finally found the courage to break it. "It took you long enough," she said softly. Daniel let out a breath that he felt he had been holding for 24 months. "I got there." "Yes," she said, stepping toward him, closing the final distance between them. "You got there. And for the record, Daniel Holt, I have been waiting for you to fix that fence properly since the first week you arrived." He reached out and took her hands. They were cold, rough with labor, and entirely perfect. He did not kiss her. It was not the time for grand, sweeping romantic gestures. It was a moment of profound, settling alignment. He held her hands, and she squeezed his, and they stood together in the freezing dark, looking out over the valley, the boundary between them finally, permanently erased. They stayed in the clearing for half an hour, talking in low, quiet voices about nothing of consequence, the impending winter, the health of her father's knee, the stubbornness of his lead gelding. It was the banter of two people who no longer needed to hide behind silence, a demonstration of the mutual respect and intellectual compatibility that had always simmered beneath the surface. When they finally began the descent back to the barn, the cold had seeped deep into their clothes, but neither of them felt it. By the time they reached the valley floor, the weather had turned again. The clear sky had been swallowed by a sudden fast-moving front off the coast, and a heavy, freezing rain had begun to fall. The dance was breaking up early, farmers hurrying to get their families home before the roads washed out completely. Daniel found Clara Nash already waiting in the wagon, hunched against the downpour. "I will ride alongside you," Daniel told Silas, shouting slightly to be heard over the drumming rain. "The creek will be rising fast." Silas looked at Daniel, then at Clara, who was climbing into the wagon seat. The old man nodded once, a sharp, knowing gesture. "Keep close." The ride back to the boundary line was treacherous. The hardened mud quickly turned back into a slick, treacherous soup, and the horses fought for footing in the dark. Daniel rode just behind the wagon, his lantern casting wild, swinging shadows through the rain. As they approached the point where the road paralleled the winding course of Teller's Creek, the sound of the water became a roar. The 3 days of previous rain, combined with the sudden deluge, had turned the usually placid creek into a churning, violent torrent of brown water and debris. They were half a mile from the Nash property when Daniel heard it. It was a thin, desperate sound, barely audible over the roar of the water and the rain. He pulled his gelding up sharp, raising a hand to halt the wagon. "What is it?" Clara called out, leaning over the side. "Listen," Daniel commanded. There it was again, a frantic, high-pitched bleat. Daniel swung down from his horse, grabbing his lantern, and moved toward the steep bank of the creek. The water was overflowing its banks, tearing at the roots of the willows. Down in the swirling eddy, pinned against a tangle of submerged branches, was a young calf. It belonged to the Cooper herd, likely washed down from the upper pasture. It was exhausted, its head barely staying above the freezing water. Daniel did not hesitate. He was a man who protected what was in his valley. He handed his lantern to Clara, who had scrambled down from the wagon to join him. "Hold this." "Daniel, the water is too fast," Clara warned, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "It will pull you under." "I can reach it," he said, already shrugging out of his heavy wool coat. He stepped to the edge of the bank. The mud was slick and crumbling. He slid down the embankment, plunging waist-deep into the freezing, violent current. The shock of the cold drove the breath from his lungs, but he pushed forward, fighting the pressure of the water, reaching for the tangle of branches. He managed to grab the calf by the scruff of its neck, hauling it upward. The animal thrashed in panic, its hooves striking Daniel's chest. "Easy," he grunted, fighting for balance. He turned to heave the calf up onto the bank. He got the animal onto the muddy shelf, but the sudden shift in weight, combined with the eroding earth beneath his boots, proved disastrous. The bank gave way. Daniel lost his footing entirely, plunging backward into the main current. The dark water closed over his head. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, but the current was incredibly strong, spinning him, dragging him downstream. He grabbed for a passing root, but it snapped in his hand. On the bank, Clara did not scream. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She dropped the lantern, turned, and sprinted back to Daniel's horse. She tore the heavy, coiled lariat from his saddle horn. She ran back to the edge of the bank, tracking his dark shape in the churning water. 30 yards downstream stood a massive, ancient cottonwood tree, its thick roots exposed along the bank. Clara ran toward it, her heavy wet dress dragging at her legs. She reached the tree, quickly looped one end of the stiff hemp rope around the massive trunk, tying a rapid, secure knot. She took the remaining coils in her hands, stepped to the very edge of the collapsing bank, and waited for the exact right second. Daniel was being swept toward her, fighting to keep his head above water, his strength failing in the freezing cold. "Daniel!" she screamed, a sound of absolute commanding authority that cut through the roar of the river. He looked up. She threw the rope. It uncoiled in the dark, a heavy, straight line. It slapped into the water 2 feet in front of him. Daniel lunged, his freezing fingers closing around the rough hemp. The instant he caught it, Clara threw her weight backward, bracing her boots against a thick root of the cottonwood. The rope went taut with a violent snap. The force of the river pulling Daniel tried to rip the rope from her hands, the rough hemp burning instantly through the skin of her palms. She did not let go. She leaned back, using the leverage of the tree and the pure, stubborn strength of a woman who had spent her life holding things together. "Hold on," she yelled, hauling backward, hand over hand, fighting the current for every inch. Daniel held on. The rope swung him in an arc toward the bank. He hit the muddy slope hard, scrambling with his boots, digging his fingers into the freezing mud. Clara kept pulling, refusing to give an inch of slack, until he had dragged himself entirely out of the water and collapsed onto the flat, saturated grass beneath the cottonwood. Clara dropped the rope and fell to her knees beside him. She was gasping for breath, her hands bleeding and coated in mud. Daniel lay on his back, staring up at the rain falling through the bare branches of the tree, his chest heaving violently. For a long moment, the only sound was the roar of the creek and their ragged breathing. Then, slowly, Daniel turned his head to look at her. He was soaked to the bone, freezing, and covered in mud. He looked at her bleeding hands, then up at her face, which was plastered with wet hair and rain. A low, rough sound started in Daniel's chest. It grew louder, rising over the noise of the storm. He was laughing. It was a deep, genuine sound of pure relief and profound disbelief. Clara stared at him, her eyes wide, and then, despite the cold and the terror of the last 3 minutes, a smile broke across her face. She let out a short, breathless laugh of her own. "A dangerous pastime," she gasped, referencing the river, the rescue, and perhaps the entire evening. Daniel pushed himself up onto his elbows, still laughing quietly. He reached out and gently touched her muddy, bleeding hand. "I am entirely done," he said, his voice ragged but utterly certain, "being your quiet neighbor." Clara looked down at him, the rain washing the mud from her cheeks. "I was hoping it would be you," she said, her voice steady and warm in the freezing night. "I have been hoping since the day you bought that land." They managed to get the exhausted calf into the back of the Nash wagon. Daniel rode the rest of the way, shivering uncontrollably, but he refused to leave the side of the wagon until they reached the Nash yard. Clara helped her father inside, then came back out with a heavy woolen blanket, throwing it over Daniel's shoulders. They stood on the porch for a moment, the rain pounding on the tin roof above them. No words were needed. The boundary had been crossed, the river had been survived, and the waiting was over. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the valley washed clean and glittering under a pale winter sun. Daniel, wearing dry clothes and moving with a slight stiffness from the ordeal of the river, walked across his yard. He did not go to the fence line. He walked to the gate, unlatched it, and walked straight up to the Nash porch. Silas Nash was sitting in a rocking chair, a thick blanket over his knees, smoking a pipe. He watched Daniel approach. Daniel stopped at the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat. "Mr. Nash," Daniel said, his voice respectful but entirely firm, "I would like to state my intentions regarding your daughter. I would like to stay, Silas, as her husband." Silas took a slow draw from his pipe, exhaled the blue smoke into the crisp air, and looked at the younger man. He had known about the fence repairs, the books, the quiet observation for at least a year. He was a father who knew his daughter's worth, and he knew a steady man when he saw one. "You are a slow man, Daniel Holt," Silas said dryly, a hint of situational irony in his tone. Town was about ready to form a committee. He tapped his pipe against the railing. "Breakfast is on the table. There are biscuits. Come inside." He said nothing else, but the invitation was absolute. The courtship that followed over the winter was a formalization of what had already existed. It was not characterized by grand romantic gestures, but by shared practicalities that felt profoundly intimate. Daniel ate Sunday dinner at the Nash table every week. They took long walks along the creek on clear afternoons, discussing the expansion of the horse pastures and the best way to shore up the barn roof. They sat on the porch in the evenings, Clara mending harness straps while Daniel read aloud from the botanical texts, intentionally mispronouncing the Latin names just to see her smile and correct him. It was a courtship of quiet companionship, of a shared understanding that their lives were now irrevocably braided together. They were married in the early spring, as the first green shoots were breaking through the dark valley soil. The ceremony was held in the very same clearing on the hillside where Daniel had finally spoken his mind. The entire town of Teller's Creek attended. Clara wore a simple, elegant dress of ivory cotton, and Daniel wore a new dark suit that Elias Thorne had ordered specifically for the occasion. When they spoke their vows, they were brief, honest, and unadorned. They promised to be steady, to be true, and to endure together. As they kissed, Elias Thorne stood in the back of the crowd, nodding slowly to himself, satisfied that the natural order of the valley had finally been restored. 8 years later, In the summer of 1895, the boundary fence between the two properties was still there, but it served only to keep the horses out of Clara's expanded vegetable garden. A wide, permanently open gate connected the 2 yards. The Nash house had been expanded, a wide wraparound porch added to accommodate the growing family. Silas had passed away quietly 2 years after the wedding, surrounded by his daughter and his son-in-law, content in the knowledge that his land and his blood were secure. On a warm July evening, Daniel and Clara sat on the porch. The Willamette Valley was bathed in the golden, hazy light of the setting sun. In the yard below, a 6-year-old boy with Daniel's solid build and Clara's dark hair was methodically trying to build a small structure out of kindling wood, while his 4-year-old sister, possessing her father's pale blue eyes, was busy feeding grass to a very patient hound dog. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a cup of coffee resting on his knee. He watched his son carefully place a piece of wood, knock the whole thing over, and patiently begin again. "He has your temperament," Clara observed, not looking up from the ledger she was balancing. "Stubborn, methodical. He is taking his time," Daniel defended mildly, a familiar, comfortable banter settling between them. "He wants to ensure the foundation is sound." Clara closed the ledger and set it on the small table beside her. She looked out over the yard, past the children, past the open gate, to the long line of cedar posts that stretched toward the creek. "Well," she said, a dry, understated humor in her voice, "let us hope he doesn't take 2 entire years to figure out how to put a roof on it." Daniel smiled, a slow, deep expression of absolute contentment. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His fingers were still calloused, hers still capable and strong. "Some things," he said softly, looking at his wife, "are worth the time it takes to see them clearly. That is the thing about the quiet ones, the steady awakeners and the patient anchors. Their love is not a sudden, violent strike of lightning that burns hot and fades quickly. It is the slow, deliberate growth of a deep root system, forcing its way through hard earth and stone, seeking water in the dark. It requires an immense, often painful amount of time to establish itself, but once it takes hold, it cannot be washed away by the sudden floods or broken by the winter ice. It is a bond forged not in the noise of a crowded room, but in the silent, shared labor of survival, in the unspoken understanding of a mended coat, a returned book, and a rope held tight against the current. Thank you for riding with me today. I am grateful you were here to witness the slow, inevitable crossing of that boundary line. Until next time, keep writing.